Before we go into further detail about different generations, it's worth taking a step back and considering how relevant these categories are to the general public. There are 4 significant generations we think about in this report. The baby boomers, those born between 1945 and 1965, Generation X, born between 1966 and 1979, the millennials, born 1980 to 1995, and Generation Z, born 1996 onwards. These definitions can shift slightly, and there are of course other cohorts, the older, pre-war generation of those born up to 1944, as well as the under-10s who are currently called Generation Alpha. But a large majority of the UK population fall into these 4 groups. So far, so theoretical. But how far do the UK public recognise these groupings? We found that awareness of generational thinking is very high. In our polling, over 9 in 10 of the public had at least some familiarity with at least one of the generational groupings we've been talking about. Only 1 in 20 said they'd not heard of any of the cohort names. And just 6% claimed to have heard of Generation Gamma, a fake cohort we invented to check for generational overclaim. When we look at our 4 key generations, Generation Z is in fact the least well known. It is the baby boomers and the millennials who have the best PR. Over 6 in 10 of the UK public said that they'd heard of each of these generations. And just under half claimed to have heard of Generation X. Just 4 in 10 said they'd heard of Generation Z. This may well reflect the fact that familiarity grows with age. Only 1 in 10 have heard of Generation Alpha, the next cohort after Gen Z. But as things stand currently, the public are less aware of Generation Z than they are of older cohorts. After we asked about broad awareness of different cohorts, we then asked participants to assign themselves to a generation. And here we saw quite a striking pattern. Almost 2/3 of those aged 57 to 77 at the time correctly identified themselves as baby boomers, which is far higher than other groups. Amongst 43 to 56-year-olds, only 37% put themselves correctly into the Generation X bracket. For those aged 27 to 42, the figure was similar, with 4 in 10 knowing their place as millennials. And looking at the 26 and unders, who are Generation Z, just 35% identified as such. This may reflect the fact that the baby boomer generation is tied into observable demographic factors in a way the other generations are not. There were in fact 2 baby booms during the period this cohort covers. But it is also a useful reminder that even if the broad outlines of generational thinking are familiar, the details often are not. And not only are Generation Z less well known, with lower self-awareness, they also have the worst reputation. Society has a long tradition of hating on young people, and this is reflected in our data. When we asked the public to associate different phrases with each of the generations, they were more than happy to stick a lot of the negative ones on the youngest generation. Gen Z were most likely to be considered as too easily offended by the things other people say, so we see the woke snowflake stereotype. Not prepared to work hard to get ahead in life and self-centered, an entitled worker stereotype. However, we also saw some other stereotypes in play that might be more positive. Gen Z are thought of as the most likely to be open to people from different lifestyles and backgrounds. They're also considered to be the most willing to make significant lifestyle changes to reduce their carbon emissions, and would explore more of the truth of this later. And other generations get the same stereotypical treatment too. The baby boomers are most likely to be considered those with the greatest influence over government decisions, and the ones most likely to benefit from public spending, a perception which may well rise further as this generation sails into retirement. In a key example of a difference a few years can make, the formerly work-shy millennials are now the most likely to value career over work-life balance, likely reflecting their shift into making ends meet whilst trying to buy homes and have families. Yet they're still the second most likely to be considered financially insecure behind Generation Z. And reinforcing another generational stereotype, Generation X weren't selected as having any especially defining characteristics. In some ways, they're the true silent generation. Perhaps more hearteningly, considering the stereotypes flying around, is the fact that all generations are viewed positively overall. Often generational thinking is cited as a precursor to intergenerational conflict, but we find that the view of all generations in the UK, amongst those who've heard of them, is net favourable. The oldest and the youngest are seen in the best light. Almost 6 in 10 feel favourable towards the 80-plus pre-war generation, while just 7% view them unfavourably. And the picture is similar with the under 10 Generation Alpha, where half are favourable and just over 1 in 10 unfavourable. But even at the middle of the age distribution, we see a positive picture. Between 3 and 10 to a third are favourable towards Generation Z, the Millennials, and Generation X, and at most 1 in 5 are unfavourable. And if we look under the top line, Members of all generations are net favourable towards Generation Z. But perhaps the most important point of this data is that we've uncovered a tension in generational identity. As we've covered, in many of the younger generations, less than half are aware of their own cohorts. Yet these younger generations are more likely to identify strongly with their cohort. So it appears that generational ID in the UK is either broad and shallow, or narrow and deep.